Hello everyone. Tonight we gently peel back the layers of romanticised history to reveal a truth often more mundane, more uncomfortable, and in its own way profoundly boring for those who lived it. As the world outside quiets down, allow your mind to softly drift as we journey back to the age of the Crusades. We'll explore the gritty, sensory-rich reality of a crusader's daily existence, beginning with the very ground beneath their weary feet, inviting you to discover a story far richer in human detail than any legend. You've heard the grand tales, haven't you? Stories of gleaming armour, noble quests, and the righteous fervour that swept across Europe, calling men to arms for a holy cause. Perhaps you envisioned stirring speeches, banners unfurling dramatically in the wind, and swift, decisive battles under a benevolent, watchful sky. But let's be honest with ourselves, those were the comforting fantasies you spun before the ink dried on your solemn vow. The stark reality, the very instant your ill-fitting boots squelched onto the muddy track, quickly dissolved any illusions of grandeur. The profound disparity between your initial expectations, fueled by fervent sermons and the promise of divine glory, and the grim, relentless reality of the campaign immediately fostered a pervasive sense of disillusionment and regret. You, along with thousands of others, had dreamed of shining armour and swift, glorious battles, only to find yourself instead facing an unglamorous and deeply uncomfortable daily existence where the promise of grandeur evaporated within days, marking a stark psychological shift. It was less a noble quest and more a very long, very wet, rather tedious walk. Your promised armour, far from being a gleaming symbol of piety, felt more akin to a hand-me-down iron sweater that carried the perpetual aroma of rust, stale sweat, and bitter disappointment. The sheer oppressive weight of it, a sensation you quickly learned was like being hugged by a sullen anvil, caused immediate and debilitating physical strain from your very first steps. It wasn't merely a burden, it was a constant metallic reminder of your ill-preparedness, digging into your shoulders, chafing at your neck and making every breath feel like a minor exertion. You quickly understood why those heroic paintings always depicted knights atop majestic steeds. Attempting to traverse any significant distance in this cumbersome contraption was an exercise in masochism. Then there was the headgear. Your conical dented helmet, likely a relic from a previous possibly more fortunate owner, offered absolutely no internal padding. As the sun beat down or the relentless wind whipped through you, became acutely aware of your skull being slow cooked, or chilled to the bone by the unyielding metal. It rattled with every jarring step, severely obstructing your peripheral vision and rendering any attempt at conversation into a muffled echo from the bottom of a well. The real challenge, however, came from your footwear. Those worn-out turn shoes, essentially soft leather slippers with minimal structural integrity, provided pitiful defence against the treacherous, mud-jagged rocks and unforgiving terrain. Within the first mile, should you be fortunate enough to avoid a sharp stone that ripped a hole in the sole, these inadequate shoes guaranteed an agonizing blister, a raw spot on your heel that metaphorically thought of opening its own church. Every subsequent step became a fresh agony, a relentless, burning reminder of your misplaced optimism. You found your thoughts consumed more by the state of your feet than by the spiritual significance of the Holy Land. That once bright surcoat, the one you had so proudly stitched with a prominent red cross, quickly devolved into a vaguely beige, spot-stained garment within a mere week. When drenched by the frequent heavy rains which seemed to possess a personal vendetta against your morale, it clung to your body like guilt, a heavy, inescapable presence. You soon learned that a wet surcoat was far more than a simple fashion faux pas. It chafed relentlessly against your skin, added significant oppressive weight to your already burdened frame, and contributed to a pervasive chill that seeped into your very bones. Every flapping, sodden movement became a further erosion of your initial enthusiasm, a constant irritating reminder of the comfort you had so foolishly abandoned. You began to wonder if holy war was actually a medieval euphemism for perpetual dampness and regret. By nightfall, after miles of arduous, painful marching, your body screaming for respite, the concept of a comfortable bed felt like a distant, absurd fantasy from another lifetime. Your only recourse was to collapse in wet grass next to strangers whose life stories you neither knew nor particularly cared to learn at that moment. Sleep, when it eventually came, was fitful and uncomfortable, much like trying to rest like a brick in a bucket. You were acutely aware of every twig, every damp patch, every shifting limb of your neighbour. This meagre rest was frequently interrupted by the weaponized snoring of companions, a symphony of guttural growls and whistling exhalations, and the biting, unexpected cold that descended once the sun had dipped below the horizon, offering little true recovery. You often awoke more tired than when you lay down, your muscles stiff, your mind already dreading the next day's endless shuffle. Should your journey involve the ignominious fate of a prolonged siege, your living conditions would plummet even further into the abyss of discomfort. The temporary tents, hastily erected and clearly designed by someone with a profound misunderstanding of structural engineering, provided laughably minimal protection. You'd witness them collapsing instantly under the force of what could only be described as biblical, angry, vengeful rain, leaving you and your companions utterly exposed to the elements. Without the canvas shield, you were left seeking an adequate shelter under trees already occupied by indifferent animals, or equally despondent rain-soaked companions. This utter vulnerability, the grim realization that even your flimsy shelter was at the mercy of the weather, drove home the profound precariousness of your existence. You weren't a holy warrior, you were just wet and miserable. And then there was the omnipresent stench. Laying siege meant prolonged, intensely intimate medieval camping outside city walls characterized by a complete and utter absence of sanitation. Imagine perpetually leaking tents, the constant damp earth, and an omnipresent nauseating smell, a thick, suffocating blend of thousands of unwashed soldiers, rotting food scraps, and the occasional dead horse left unceremoniously where it fell. This collective odour created a suffocating biohazard that perpetually hung in the air, clinging to your clothes, your hair, your very skin. It was a constant olfactory assault, a visceral reminder of the squalor that became your daily reality. You learned to breathe shallowly, to adapt to simply exist within this miasma, desperately trying to recall what clean air or indeed any pleasant scent even felt like. For many of you, the initial allure of the Crusades had been an escape from the unending agricultural toil back home, the monotony of ploughing the same field for 14 years, and the predictable, uninspiring diet of barley onions and whatever didn't escape the stew pot. You yearned for something different, something grander, even if you weren't entirely sure what that something was. The cruel irony, however, quickly became apparent. This grand escape led directly to an even more meagre, unappetizing and fundamentally uncertain diet on the march. You had traded one form of suffering for another, perhaps even a worse one, with the gnawing uncertainty of hunger. Now your constant companion, a stark reminder that some chains are merely exchanged for others. The truth is, the Crusades epitomized one of the most disorganized, poorly planned mass movements in human history. The very concepts of logistics, or reliable supply lines, seemed utterly alien to the minds of those who orchestrated this massive undertaking. How else could one explain the sheer systemic failure to sustain such a vast force over vast distances? Consequently, the promised provisions, the very sustenance you had been assured would be plentiful, were invariably either mouldy missing or currently being hoarded by the unscrupulous few who saw opportunity in collective desperation. This left the vast majority of you to fend for yourselves, a grim daily struggle for calories that quickly overshadowed any spiritual ambitions. By day 4, your stomach wasn't just rumbling, it was singing hymns for food, loud and desperate, much like those mournful tunes heard at funerals. It was a visceral, undeniable expression of acute hunger, a hollow ache that echoed through your entire being. Breakfast, if you were one of the lucky few to procure anything at all, often consisted of black bread so dense it could be used as siege equipment. This wasn't merely bread, it was an exercise in endurance. It required a long, arduous chew that often lasted 20 minutes without you making significant progress until your teeth simply grew bored of the Sisyphean task. You'd chew and chew, feeling your jaw ache, and still the brick-like substance resisted all efforts at consumption, a testament to its unyielding nature. Formal lunch was by and large a rarity, a quaint concept from a bygone era of plenty. It was swiftly replaced by handfuls of dried peas, which taste like despair and medieval dust, offering little comfort and even less sustenance, a powdery, gritty reminder of your predicament. With official supplies depleted and the promises of your leaders ringing hollow, you and your fellow crusaders resorted to desperate foraging. You'd pick through fields and forests, often relying on ill-informed advice like that of a man named Gerald, who you'd heard once ate a candle. This reliance on dubious expertise, especially when encountering unknown berries or suspicious fungi, led inevitably to hours spent behind a convenient tree, questioning everything, as your digestive system rebelled with an alarming ferocity. You learned quickly and painfully that not all nature's bounty was meant for human consumption, especially when chosen in desperation. Dinner frequently featured what was optimistically called a glorious, mysterious stew. The exact contents of this murky concoction remained an enigma, prompting a daily guessing game among your companions. The chewy bits, for instance, spurred guesses ranging from rabbit to boot sole, both of which seemed equally plausible given the circumstances. Despite the unsettling ambiguity of its ingredients, everyone ate it without question, out of sheer, undeniable necessity. There was no room for culinary preferences or delicate palates when survival was on the line. You often left the meal full not of food, just of regret. The taste lingering unpleasantly, your dreams haunted by visions of palatable bread and cheese that wasn't green on purpose, a peculiar hue you'd come to associate with everything from your food to your perpetually damp clothes. As your weary, unwashed procession approached local villages, you quickly learned that the inhabitants were far from welcoming. They viewed your presence not as a divine intervention, but as the arrival of a walking plague parade, a harbinger of scarcity and trouble. Consequently, they frequently barred their gates, or if they did allow entry, engaged in blatant price gouging. Imagine being charged half a chicken just to use the well for a gulp of lukewarm, potentially contaminated water. Or being offered bread that's older than your shoes, a stale rock-hard disc at an exorbitant price. Every interaction with these local economies became a frustrating, exploitative skirmish, a stark reminder that even on a holy quest, the mundane realities of supply and demand and outright opportunism held sway. You were not liberators. You were simply an inconvenient, hungry multitude, a tourist group with far too many swords and not enough sense. During prolonged sieges, when the grand plans of your leaders invariably faltered and progress stalled, the dwindling supplies pushed desperation to its absolute limits. The concept of rations became a cruel joke. Soldiers were reduced to the unthinkable, catching and naming rats not as pets but as dinner. You'd witness arguments heated and desperate, even breaking out over whether to eat the army's scruffy, long-suffering mascot goat, which until then had been a source of fleeting, if bizarre, comfort. These grim episodes vividly illustrated the dire levels of deprivation and the complete breakdown of normal dietary taboos. Hunger, you discovered, was a ruthless master, stripping away civility and making every living creature a potential meal. Within days of the march, commencing any semblance of personal hygiene plummeted into an unspeakable state. You, like everyone else, rapidly found yourself smelling like a combination of wet iron regret and something you hope isn't fungal. The romantic ideal of a clean, virtuous crusader quickly evaporated. The very concept of bathing, once a noble goal, or even a weekly ritual back home, rapidly receded into a vague memory. much like clean socks or personal boundaries. You learn to tolerate your own odour and, more disturbingly, the pervasive aroma of thousands of others. The campaign was not just a test of faith and endurance, it was a profound assault on your sense of smell, and indeed your dignity. The sheer scale of unwashed bodies ensured that the entire crusading force developed a strong collective aroma. You didn't just smell yourself, you smelled the army. It transformed all of you into one big walking cheese wheel of sweat dust and medieval body odour, a mobile human-scale artisanal cheese factory whose product no one was keen to sample. This pervasive scent was not merely unpleasant, it became a constant, inescapable environmental factor, a thick, invisible shroud that clung to every man, every tent, every piece of equipment. You breathed it in with every breath, a constant reminder of the squalor you inhabited. It was a smell that once experienced would forever define your memories of the crusade, a signature of collective suffering. Soap that simple modern convenience you now take for granted was virtually non-existent in this medieval reality. It was often a mythical item, or perhaps something carved from tallow and self-delusion, if you were truly desperate. Water, when it could eventually be found, was a precious commodity mostly reserved for drinking, or for the more urgent life-saving purpose of pouring onto open wounds while screaming. The idea of using this valuable, often scarce resource for the luxurious act of washing one's body was considered an unattainable indulgence for commoners. You quickly adapted to a life where cleanliness was a forgotten dream, replaced by the more pressing need for hydration and basic survival. Your clothes, once proudly stitched with a vibrant red cross, rapidly deteriorated. They became a battlefield in fabric form, scarred with mud sweat and unknown stains. Your undergarments, a concept that now seems quaint, quickly became fused to your skin in certain areas, a testament to weeks, perhaps months, without removal or washing. Your boots, which had promised protection, became perpetually damp, seeming possibly alive and definitely angry, fostering a constant state of damp, unsanitary discomfort for your already aching feet. The constant dampness, the abrasive fabric, and the sheer filth conspired to create a never-ending cycle of chafing and skin irritation, making every movement a minor torment. Lice infestations were not an unfortunate incident. They were a universal and relentless reality. These tiny, maddening creatures moved in uninvited and proceeded to throw a party within your helmets, your hair, and every seam of your clothing. The incessant maddening itching, particularly at night when the cold and damp allowed no other distractions, became so widespread that it transformed into the unofficial marching rhythm, scratch, scratch, shuffle, groan. It was a shared involuntary torment, a collective symphony of discomfort that united the entire force in a grim, irritating bond. You learned to live with them, to scratch without thinking, to accept them as yet another unwelcome companion on your holy journey. The complete absence of latrines or indeed any form of organised sanitation ensured that privacy for bodily functions was utterly non-existent. You were forced to relieve yourself wherever dignity officially gives up, which for most was fairly early in the campaign. This led to awkward, eye-contact stories with strangers you'll never forget, moments of profound shared embarrassment that underscored the complete erosion of personal boundaries. The natural landscape became your toilet, and the sheer number of people meant that finding a truly private spot was an impossible luxury. You quickly shed any lingering sense of modesty, understanding that such niceties had no place in this brutal communal existence. Yet amidst this universal squalor and profound physical suffering, there was always one inexplicably clean crusader. His armour somehow gleamed, his tunic improbably seemed less stained, and he maddeningly smelled like lavender. This individual, whether a miracle of personal fortitude, a secret stash of soap, or simply a collective hallucination born of desperation, became a source of deep, resentful hatred among his grimy, aching companions. His very existence highlighted the lost dream of personal cleanliness and the stark reality of the universal suffering, making his pristine state an insult to everyone else's misery. You'd eye him with a mixture of disbelief and a simmering desire to push him into the nearest mud puddle just to see if he'd still smell like flowers. For many commoners, joining the Crusades was seen as an escape from the unending repetitive drudgery of ploughing the same field for 14 years and milking goats in the rain. You sought something different, a break from the familiar, often soul-crushing toil of agrarian life. Paradoxically, you traded this familiar if monotonous labour for a new form of equally demanding, often more brutal and far less productive labour on the march. This compounding of your feelings of regret was a bitter pill to swallow. You had simply swapped one form of back-breaking work for another this time, with the added indignity of knowing you were lost hungry and covered in lice. The grass, it turned out, was not greener on the other side of the continent. The long-groaning shuffle across Europe was not a glorious charge into battle. It was a physically exhausting endeavour that tested the very limits of human endurance. It involved thousands of confused, underfed people, dragging carts laden with meagre possessions, unruly goats, bewildered children, and in one memorable instance a piano that no one quite knew how to play but everyone insisted on bringing. This continuous soul-sapping movement quickly made your shoulders feel cursed. The constant pressure of your pack and gear digging in while your feet turned into soup, a tender, blistered mess of skin and bone. It was a relentless, monotonous test of physical endurance, a daily struggle against fatigue and pain that left you utterly drained long before nightfall. The physically taxing nature of the march was exacerbated by the cumbersome ill-fitting gear you were forced to carry. That chainmail, your iron sweater, constantly dug into your neck, causing persistent irritation and rubbing raw patches on your skin. Even a seemingly meagre pack containing exactly 2 onions and an old biscuit felt impossibly heavy, with every step contributing to a crushing, pervasive fatigue that never truly abated. You learned to hate the weight, the chafing, the relentless pressure of every item you possessed. It wasn't just physical, it was a psychological burden, a constant reminder of the physical demands that relentlessly wore you down, making even the simplest task an arduous chore. The journey itself was a continuous battle against the environment and often your own body. You constantly tripped over unseen rocks, spraining your dignity more often than your ankle stumbling and regaining your footing with a grumble. You were stepped on by passing donkeys, their indifferent hooves adding insult to injury, and suffered debilitating chafing that felt like divine punishment, a burning constant agony in places you'd rather not mention. These minor yet relentless discomforts accumulated, transforming sustained movement into a painful ordeal, making every single step a testament to sheer willpower, rather than any sense of purpose or glory. You realized that true heroism wasn't in slaying dragons. It was in enduring another mile another day with your feet still mostly attached. Should your crusade eventually reach its intended destination, or rather the walls of a besieged city, you would find yourself engaged in the brutal, often futile toil of siege warfare. This demanded intense physical labour under constant harassment from the enemy. You'd spend your days digging extensive trenches, attempting to erect flimsy siege towers that seemed perpetually on the verge of collapse, and futilely trying to construct siege engines that often disintegrated upon their first pathetic launch. This repetitive, often fruitless labour was coupled with the endless complaining of your comrades, the oppressive stench of the encampment, and the constant threat of a well-aimed arrow or stone from above. It was exhausting, demoralising work seemingly designed to break your spirit as much as the enemy's walls. Actual combat, when it finally arrived, was far from glorious. Forget the choreographed duels and elegant swordplay of the troubadours' songs. It was a chaotic, disorienting nightmare of wild, clumsy swings with dull, heavy swords. You'd struggle with vision-blocking helmets that limited your sight to a narrow slit, stumble over rubble and the fallen, and face the terrifying prospect of being trampled underfoot by friends and foes alike. This brutal reality vividly illustrated the common soldier's complete lack of formal training and the overall disorganization of the battle lines. It was not a clash of strategies, it was a terrifying every-man-for-himself free-for-all, where survival depended more on sheer luck and the ability to swing wildly than on any martial skill. After the deafening noise subsides, after the clash of steel and the cries of men have faded, you as a survivor would be left panting, bruised, and smelling like old stew and bad choices. You'd often be bleeding from wounds you couldn't even remember incurring in the chaos. The battlefield, once a cacophony of terror, settled into a grim tableau of exhaustion and suffering. In an ignominious display, you might even see a helmet repurposed as a soup bowl, not out of practicality, but out of sheer desperation and the need to survive. This mundane, unglamorous sight underscored the profound lack of dignity and the raw, unadorned reality of merely staying alive, a far cry from the heroic narratives you had once envisioned. Your only victory was simply drawing another breath, however ragged. The most striking aspect of your preparation for this holy war was the complete lack of formal military training for most common crusaders. You were after all just a peasant, a baker, a cobbler. You were equipped with little more than a kitchen knife, a frying pan, and whatever's left of your dignity. This stark reality highlighted the amateur nature of much of the army, a ragtag collection of fervent believers rather than disciplined warriors. You were expected to fight, to march, to survive with no instruction beyond a vague sense of divine purpose and the most rudimentary of implements. It was a recipe for disaster, and yet here you were, a testament to the power of faith, or perhaps simply desperation. Any education you received on the march was purely pragmatic and often dangerous, focused squarely on immediate survival. This included the desperate foraging for berries, often with disastrous stomach-churning results, as you've already experienced. You learned through trial and error how to navigate treacherous terrain, how to distinguish between edible and poisonous plants, mostly through unfortunate experimentation, and perhaps most importantly, how to simply endure relentless discomfort. This was a harsh, unwritten curriculum taught by the campaign itself, with painful lessons learned through hunger, illness, and constant physical strain. There were no textbooks, only the unforgiving land and the brutal realities of existence. An unsettling sight, a band of children, whose origins were a mystery to everyone, marched alongside the adults for weeks. Surprisingly, these young, resilient souls often exhibited better morale than many of the supposedly seasoned crusaders, their youthful resilience a stark contrast to the weary despair of the grown-ups. Their presence underscored the chaotic, non-military composition of the force, blurring the traditional societal roles and highlighting the profound desperation that had led even the youngest to join this ill-fated pilgrimage. You often wondered what they understood of this quest, and if their innocence shielded them, or simply delayed their inevitable disillusionment. Leadership, you quickly observed, frequently fell to individuals like a fresh-faced noble, barely out of his teens, whose strategic mind seemed to be still in its infancy. His tactical prowess, for instance, might be exemplified by confidently pointing towards a distant hill and bellowing "Forward, men!" before promptly getting lost himself. This sort of profound inexperience meant that you, the rank and file, received no proper guidance. This systemic ineptitude at the top contributed to widespread confusion, often resulting in comical yet dangerous blunders that cost lives and precious resources. You quickly learned to distrust the grand pronouncements from the front, realizing that your survival depended more on your own wits and the shared experience of your immediate companions than on any strategic genius from above. It was a hard lesson to learn, often punctuated by unnecessary suffering. The ultimate education for you, the common crusader, was a painful lesson in disillusionment. You learned with a bitter clarity that no one knows what they're doing. The grand proclamations of divine guidance and strategic brilliance were revealed to be hollow. Survival, you quickly understood, depended far more on strong shoes and not eating anything that's still moving than on any grand strategy or divine intervention. This fundamental shift in understanding profoundly reshaped your worldview. The abstract ideals that had propelled you from your home were replaced by a stark pragmatism, a focus on the immediate tangible realities of staying alive one painful, uncomfortable day at a time. The faith wasn't gone, perhaps, but it was certainly complicated, now seasoned with mud and practical wisdom. Amidst these deeply personal trials and the relentless physical demands of the march, the foundational realities of the era, from its unforgiving environment to its flawed logistical systems and inherent social inequalities, loomed as inescapable macro-level forces. These systemic elements shaped every aspect of your arduous ordeal, anchoring and constraining every individual experience within a larger, unyielding framework. You weren't just an individual on a journey. You were a single insignificant cog in a vast, unwieldy machine subject to forces far beyond your control forces that often conspired against your very survival. The personal discomfort was merely a symptom of a much larger, more pervasive systemic failure. Now let's step back for a moment from your immediate personal misery and look at the broader canvas upon which this suffering was painted. This segment will establish the macro-level context of the historical period, the invisible chains that bound everyone from the lowliest peasant to the most powerful noble. You might think your daily struggles were unique, but they were in fact merely echoes of a far grander systemic reality. We'll delve into the fundamental social hierarchy, the core economic base, and the pervasive environmental realities that broadly apply to the entire society and campaign, providing the systemic backdrop to the individual suffering you just experienced. It's all connected, you see, in ways that make the past feel both distant and strangely familiar. The Crusades at their very core were initiated by an act of immense, albeit distant authority, the Pope's declaration that anyone joining the crusade would receive full forgiveness of sins. This served as the paramount top-down incentive, a spiritual decree that transcended existing social boundaries, effectively mobilizing a vast disparate force. For you, a commoner, this divine promise offered a universal spiritual reward accessible to all irrespective of social standing. It was a powerful, irresistible call, drawing in the pious, the desperate and the hopeful alike, promising eternal salvation in exchange for earthly suffering. You might have been a nobody at home, but on this journey you were promised a direct line to heaven. This spiritual mandate was meant to override all other concerns, yet as you've seen, it often struggled to contend with the more immediate demands of hunger, disease, and inept leadership. While noblemen ostensibly led the crusading forces, their actual engagement with the daily suffering of the common foot soldier, which of course included you, was minimal, to put it mildly. They often rode past, perched majestically on their horses, offering vague, almost comical, inspirational pronouncements like "forward men," before promptly disappearing for the rest of the day, presumably to better accommodations or more engaging company. This highlighted a significant and frustrating detachment from the harsh realities faced by the majority. You rarely saw them getting their hands dirty, sharing your mouldy bread, or enduring the biting cold. Their leadership felt more like a symbolic presence, a distant star rather than a guiding light leaving you to navigate the real world of mud and hunger on your own. The stark realities of the social hierarchy manifested in profound material inequalities that were impossible to ignore. Proper armour, the kind that actually protected and fit, was a luxury. Clean clothing, a distant memory for you, was similarly reserved for the elite. Even basic hygiene, the ability to at least attempt some semblance of cleanliness, was reserved for nobles and people with significantly fewer blisters. This constant visual and sensory reminder underscored the deep economic and social divide that persisted even within a supposedly unified Holy Army. Your suffering was not just personal, it was a class distinction, a daily indignity that separated you from the comfortable few. The varied quality of equipment served as a constant glaring visual marker of social class. You'd see knights, or at least minor nobles, appearing in full mail, their armour dull but undeniably present, a testament to their wealth and status. Meanwhile, commoners like yourself were often reduced to wearing a pot on his head, for a helmet, or being shirtless with a wooden shield. He carved himself their meagre self-made gear, a stark symbol of their humble origins and acute lack of resources. These material disparities were not merely superficial, they directly impacted survival, turning every skirmish into a far deadlier proposition for those at the bottom of the social ladder. You often wondered if those with cooking pots on their heads were expected to miraculously deflect enemy swords or simply to serve as a distraction. This systemic flaw in military leadership became glaringly apparent through individuals like the freshly minted noble who, despite his grand title, was remarkably devoid of any real strategic acumen. Imagine a general whose most memorable tactical maneuver involved a charge into a cabbage field only to then adamantly declare it a master plan. This profound inexperience was not an isolated incident, but a symptom of a broader issue that plagued the entire endeavour. This kind of amateur detached leadership meant that disciplined strategy was a pipe dream, making prolonged survival for the common soldier an improbability rather than a goal. You, the foot soldier, bore the brunt of these errors, paying with your energy, your health, and sometimes your life for the whims of the privileged and unprepared. Far from being a cohesive fighting force, the Crusades were deeply fractured by internal drama and social rivalries. You'd witness knights arguing with bishops over matters of dogma or perceived slights, their disputes often escalating into public shouting matches that carried across the camp, undermining any pretense of unified command. Nobles squabbled fiercely over anticipated loot or past grievances. Even peasants, finding themselves adrift in this chaos, would form independent prayer groups, often with their own interpretations of the holy mission, further fragmenting any shared purpose. This constant internal strife and inefficiency meant that the enemy wasn't just outside the walls, it was often within the ranks, a pervasive disunity that crippled the entire endeavour. You were supposed to be united by faith, but you were divided by just about everything else. Before you joined this grand, chaotic pilgrimage, your existence was overwhelmingly defined by an agrarian economy. You were tied to the land, ploughing the same field for 14 years, your life a relentless cycle dictated by seasons and crops. Your diet revolved around basic staples, barley onions, and whatever humble fare you could coax from the earth. This fundamental, unyielding struggle for basic sustenance shaped your decision to seek eternal glory as an escape from unyielding poverty. The promise of spiritual reward combined with the hope of a better life, or at least a different one, was a powerful draw, a desperate gamble against the certainty of endless toil. You might not have been happy, but at least you were certain of your next meal, a certainty quickly lost on the crusade. The Crusades, from a purely practical standpoint, represent a monumental logistical failure. You might even call it an utter catastrophe, a masterclass in how not to organise a mass movement. There was no logistics, no reliable supply line, a fatal flaw for one of the most disorganised, poorly planned mass movements in human history. This systemic breakdown meant the army of which you were a part was perpetually on the brink of starvation. There was no effective means to feed its thousands of participants, no consistent way to transport vital provisions over vast, often hostile distances. Every day was a gamble, every meal a stroke of luck, and the gnawing ache in your stomach was a constant reminder of the grand systemic oversight. You were a soldier, but your primary battle was with hunger. The already precarious supply lines, fragile and insufficient to begin with, were frequently targeted not always by opposing armies, but often by the local peasantry themselves. These villagers, far from being eager to assist your holy cause, were understandably unwilling to donate their entire winter food store to a bunch of crusaders who just trampled their turnips. They saw your army not as saviours but as invaders, a hungry horde that threatened their own meagre survival. Consequently, they actively raided and disrupted the supply chain, highlighting the intense clash of economic interests and local resistance. Your own comrades, those entrusted with securing provisions, often struggled against a cunning and motivated local populace who simply wanted you gone and were willing to fight for their livelihood. Towns and villages along the Crusaders' route, instead of offering aid or succour, frequently engaged in rampant exploitation, or price gouging, as you might call it today. You'd approach a settlement hoping for respite and supplies, only to find them charging exorbitant rates for essential commodities. Imagine being demanded half a chicken just to use the well for a sip of water, or being offered bread that's older than your shoes at a price that would make a king wince. Every interaction with these local economies was a draining, exploitative ordeal, further depleting your already meagre financial resources if you had any left at all. You quickly learned that piety didn't buy you discounts, and that local merchants cared little for your holy mission when there was profit to be made from your desperation. Even within the army, the harsh economic reality quickly led to resource hoarding. You'd observe figures like Brother Ulrich, who, despite his pious pronouncements, insists he's fasting for spiritual clarity while chewing suspiciously in the dark. His furtive movements and averted gaze spoke volumes. This exemplified the immediate selfish scramble for scarce food, revealing the raw economic drivers of individual behaviour amidst collective deprivation. When hunger became a constant companion charity, and shared resources often gave way to self-preservation. It was a dog-eat-dog world, even within the holy host, a grim illustration that even the most pious could succumb to the primal urge for survival when faced with acute scarcity. The holy war rapidly blurred into an opportunity for plunder upon reaching cities, or indeed any settlement that couldn't effectively defend itself. You'd witness crusaders seizing relics, which could be anything from a dubious toe bone, allegedly belonging to a saint, to a common chicken, mistaken for something sacred, or even a tapestry that simply looked valuable. This opportunistic looting demonstrated how economic desperation and the promise of material gain quickly overshadowed the initial spiritual objectives. The quest for salvation often morphed into a quest for tangible wealth, a pragmatic shift that revealed the underlying human motivations when faced with relentless hardship and the intoxicating prospect of immediate reward. You learn to keep an eye out not just for the enemy, but for anything valuable your fellow crusaders might snatch before you could. From the very outset, your journey was defined by severe environmental challenges. The muddy roads of Europe set a tone of constant physical struggle, clinging to your ill-fitting boots, making every step a laborious squelch. The varied terrain, dense forests where you could easily lose your way, treacherous swamps that threatened to swallow you whole, and rugged mountains that seemed to scrape the very sky, presented a relentless series of obstacles. This ensured that simply walking was a monumental task, draining your energy and taxing your spirit. You weren't merely traversing a landscape, you were battling it, a constant physical struggle against an indifferent, often hostile natural world. The weather frequently shifted dramatically, with the skies opening like a sarcastic baptism, delivering biblical angry vengeful rain. This wasn't a gentle shower, it was a deluge that transformed roads into impassable mudslides, drenched everything you owned, and ensured a pervasive dampness that seeped into your bones and more insidiously into your morale. Comfort became an impossibility, a forgotten luxury. The constant wetness, the cold, the sheer misery of being perpetually sodden became a defining characteristic of your existence. You'd shiver curse and simply endure, hoping for a fleeting glimpse of sun that rarely materialized, knowing that the sky itself seemed to be conspiring against you. Then as you pressed further, particularly into the Holy Land, you encountered the sweltering heat. This heat was profoundly debilitating, causing your chainmail to feel like a cast iron oven designed by Satan. The metal, instead of protecting you, became an instrument of torture, trapping the heat against your skin. This intense heat-induced mirages caused relentless sweating that soaked through your clothes and armour and left you crying quietly from sheer exhaustion and unquenchable thirst. It was a brutal climatic challenge, a relentless drain on your physical and mental reserves, making every movement an act of immense will. You realised with a heavy heart that the Holy Land offered its own unique and equally brutal forms of suffering. But the desert's mood could flip dramatically after sunset, bringing a cold that made you shiver like a cursed tambourine. This extreme temperature drop from scorching heat to biting chill was a profound shock to your system. Fingers would grow stiff and numb, refusing to work, and your sword, if you could still hold it, would turn into an ice sculpture, useless and impossibly heavy. This added another layer of physical torment and introduced the constant threat of hypothermia, a silent, insidious killer. You learned to dread the setting sun as much as the midday blaze, understanding that nature's relentless fury was an adversary far more consistent and unforgiving than any human foe. Disease was a constant systemic threat, spreading faster than gossip at a monastery through the densely packed unsanitary encampments. From alarming purple rashes that spread inexplicably across your skin to debilitating fevers that left you weak, and delirious illness was an ever-present companion. Medieval medicine, or with its utterly ineffective treatments of prayer, bleeding, or being told to walk it off, offered no real succour. Healers overwhelmed and relying on rudimentary, often ineffectual methods could do little. This led to widespread illness, a constant gnawing fear of impending death, and the grim reality that your fellow crusaders were often more of a vector for contagion than a source of strength. You realised that simply avoiding illness was a miracle in itself, a testament to sheer luck and a resilient constitution. The scarcity of clean water was a critical systemic threat. You were often forced to refill your flasks from streams that were only a few yards upstream, being used as toilets by horses and indeed other crusaders. You accepted the grim reality that hydration is hydration, despite the obvious and immediate health risks. This desperate reliance on contaminated sources contributed directly to widespread illness, creating a vicious cycle where thirst led to disease, and disease weakened you further, making you more susceptible to the next contaminated gulp. The very act of sustaining life became a perilous gamble, a constant compromise with unsanitary realities that few modern minds could truly comprehend. There was a complete absence of formal relief efforts, medical infrastructure, or organised support for the sick and injured. This meant that individuals like you faced disease environmental challenges and the trauma of battle largely on your own. Healers, when available, were overwhelmed and relied on rudimentary, often ineffectual methods. There were no field hospitals, no organised supply of medicines, no system for evacuating the wounded. You learned to look after yourself or rely on the kindness, or more often the grim resignation of your immediate companions. This systemic neglect ensured that every injury, every illness became a profound, isolating ordeal, making death a far more common outcome than recovery. Now, having glimpsed the systemic and daily hardships, we turn our attention to the concrete mechanisms of governance, social control and enforcement. You might assume there was some grand coherent plan, some guiding hand orchestrating this massive undertaking. But the reality, as you'll see, was far more chaotic. This segment will reveal how the lack of coherent power structures often led to disarray, and how you, the common crusader, navigated or challenged this rigid, often ineffective system. It's where the abstract ideals of leadership met the messy reality of human nature under immense pressure, and where the exercise of power was often an exercise in futility. The crusade commenced under the immense, albeit distant, authority of the Pope. His declaration of spiritual absolution served as the primary overarching command, framing the entire endeavour as a divine mission, and requiring unquestioning obedience to its stated goals. This top-down spiritual power was the initial, most potent form of control a theological lever pulled from afar that set thousands of people like you in motion. You were not just a soldier, you were an instrument of divine will, or so you were told. This spiritual mandate was meant to override all other concerns, yet as you've seen it often struggled to contend with the more immediate demands of a hunger disease and inept leadership. The promise of heaven, it turned out, did little to fill an empty stomach. Despite this grand papal mandate, the expedition was plagued by a complete breakdown of effective military leadership. Commanders often relied on vague maps so primitive one might even have a dragon drawn in the corner to mark uncharted territory, and offered general unhelpful commands like "forward" at every fork in the road. This signified a profound lack of tactical control and strategic foresight that made sustained progress an illusion. You, the foot soldier, often found yourself marching blindly, following orders that seemed to lack any genuine direction, contributing to the pervasive sense of confusion and futility. It was less a military campaign, and more a very large, very slow, very lost parade led by people with an enthusiasm for grand gestures, but no capacity for practical navigation. The presence of a greenhorn noble as a commanding officer, whose tactical prowess extended to little more than charging into a cabbage field and adamantly insisting it was a master plan, highlighted a severe incompetence at the top. This detached amateur leadership directly contributed to the overall disarray and the high likelihood of common soldiers like yourself not lasting a day. There was no real military discipline or strategic intelligence guiding your movements. Instead, you were often subject to the whims and blunders of inexperienced aristocrats, whose only qualification for leadership seemed to be their birthright. You learned quickly that their grand titles offered no immunity from making disastrous decisions that affected your very survival. Actual battle strategy, particularly for the common soldier, was almost non-existent. When you were finally thrown into combat, it often devolved into little more than yelling charge and hoping the other guy is more confused than you are. There was no coordinated movement, no disciplined formations, no clear objectives beyond brute force. This absence of disciplined command and coordinated tactics ensured a terrifying, every man for himself, free-for-all increasing casualty rates and psychological trauma for those who survived. You weren't part of a well-oiled machine. You were a single, flailing body in a swirling vortex of chaos, desperately trying to survive the next sword swing. The reality was a bloody, mud-soaked scramble far from any heroic ballet. The crusading army, far from being a unified entity, was a patchwork of warring factions suffering from profound internal drama. You'd witness knights arguing with bishops over matters of doctrine or the spoils of war, their disputes often escalating into public shouting matches that carried across the camp, undermining any pretense of unified command. Nobles squabbled fiercely over territories, perceived insults, or the most advantageous positions in camp. Even the peasants, perhaps feeling the lack of any real authority, formed independent prayer groups or mini-sects, each with their own leader and slightly different interpretation of the divine mission. This constant internal strife and inefficiency meant that the enemy wasn't just outside the walls. It was often within the ranks, a pervasive disunity that crippled the entire endeavour. You were supposed to be united by faith, but you were divided by just about everything else from linguistics to saintly preferences. Relations with supposed allies, particularly those in the Byzantine Empire, were characterized by deep suspicion and outright hostility. As you marched through their lands, city gates were often locked against your approaching horde, and archers were strategically placed on walls to enforce distance and deter any attempts at unauthorized entry or plunder. This pervasive mistrust across various powers prevented any effective collaboration and underscored a fundamental lack of common ground beyond the most superficial of religious aims. You, the foot soldier, often felt isolated and unwelcome, viewed as little more than a barbarian mob by the very people you were supposedly there to help. It was a bizarre dynamic, fighting for a cause while being treated like an enemy by everyone along the way. Despite the explicit goals and commands from distant spiritual leaders, the journey often became an aimless march, fueled by a collective refusal to admit you're walking in a very large circle. This was a subtle yet potent form of passive collective dissent against the obvious failures of command and direction. You might complain amongst yourselves, you might grumble and sigh, but the momentum of the mass continued, driven by a reluctance to acknowledge the futility of it all. This collective self-deception, this shared denial of reality, had a profound impact on overall progress and morale. It was easier perhaps to keep walking in circles than to confront the devastating truth that your leaders were utterly lost and you were simply following their bewildered meanderings. For you, the common crusader formal legal structures or individual rights were virtually non-existent. You had left behind the rudimentary, if imperfect, legal systems of your home village. Out here, the will of your immediate superiors, or simply the prevailing chaos of the camp, dictated outcomes. You were left vulnerable to arbitrary decisions, baseless accusations, and the raw exercise of power with absolutely no recourse for injustice. There was no court, no judge, no appeal. Your fate was often decided by the mood of a knight, the whim of a petty lord, or the brute force of a stronger man. You learned quickly that the concept of justice was a luxury not afforded to those at the bottom of the hierarchy, and certainly not on the long road to somewhere you'd never see. The pervasive illness that swept through the Crusader ranks, largely a direct result of shared unsanitary conditions, created a grim de facto system where your survival depended acutely on surviving your fellow Crusaders' immune systems. This highlighted a tragic form of collective fate. The poor health, the coughing, the alarming rashes of one individual could fatally impact many others, without any individual legal accountability for the spread of disease. It was a macabre lottery, where the weakest links in the chain of health threatened everyone. You understood with a sinking feeling that your personal well-being was inextricably linked to the biological fortitude of the thousands of unwashed disease-ridden people around you. One sneeze from a tent mate could be your unmaking. Local communities along the route, weary and often openly hostile to the Crusaders' presence, frequently implemented their own forms of resistance and enforcement. This included the desperate act of barring gates, engaging in rampant price gouging for basic necessities, and even in some cases throwing turnips or other projectiles at the invaders. These actions demonstrated an effective localized form of control over access to their vital resources, and showcased a dynamic where local power, however limited, could directly challenge the authority of the passing army. You might have been part of a grand holy force, but to these villagers you were simply a hungry, disruptive menace to be driven away by any means necessary. Locals actively provided misleading directions, aiming to send the Crusaders away, or on fruitless detours rather than assisting their progress. This subtle sabotage was an effective form of resistance, contributing to the army's perpetual state of being lost and further eroding your morale. You'd march for days trusting the vague hand gestures of a local, only to find yourself deep in a forest miles from where you intended to be. It was a silent war of attrition, where the local populace used their intimate knowledge of the land against the cumbersome, clueless invaders. You learned that navigating this world was far more complex than simply following a map, especially when the map itself was suspect or the locals actively wished you ill. Within the Crusader camps, the lack of formal enforcement led to rampant internal disorder. Brawls over who stole whose crust of bread were common, often escalating into violent confrontations. In the vacuum of coherent leadership, self-appointed leaders emerged, often charismatic but utterly unqualified figures who exploited the desperation of the masses. The absence of clear rules or predictable consequences for internal transgressions further destabilized the already precarious social structure. It was an environment where might often made right, and where the closest thing to law was the strength of your arm. or the loyalty of your immediate companions. You quickly learned that survival often meant avoiding conflict within your own ranks, as much as avoiding the external enemy. The initial appeal of the Crusades was profoundly tied to the promise of eternal glory and full forgiveness of sins from the Pope. This spiritual incentive offered a clear path to honour and salvation, a divine validation for embarking on a journey you were in truth ill-equipped to survive. You, a commoner, might never achieve earthly fame, but here was a chance for an immortal reward, a celestial promotion. This powerful motivation superseded fears of hardship, hunger, and even death, framing your arduous journey as a righteous path to spiritual redemption. You truly believed that every step, every suffering brought you closer to God's grace, a divine purpose that shimmered just beyond the constant grime. Yet in the face of relentless and overwhelming hardship, the conventional concept of honour dramatically shifted from grand achievements to mere endurance. Being alive after battle became as close to victory as most people ever get. The romantic notions of heroic deeds quickly faded, replaced by a stark, pragmatic understanding of success. For you, the common soldier honour was no longer about slaying a formidable foe or performing an act of breathtaking valour. It was about the raw, visceral act of survival. Each sunrise you witnessed, each meal you managed to scrounge, each painful step you took was a testament to your endurance, a quiet personal victory against impossible odds. Simply continuing to exist was in itself a defiance. The romanticized ideal of banners waving, swords clashing with poetic timing was brutally replaced by the gritty, terrifying reality of combat. Instead of glory, you found dirt in your mouth, noise in your soul. The clash of steel was replaced by the messy thud of flesh, the poetic timing by chaotic, desperate struggles. This stark confrontation with the unglamorous, visceral nature of medieval warfare led to a deep psychological disillusionment with the very idea of glorious combat. You didn't feel heroic. You felt terrified, confused, and utterly insignificant in the swirling vortex of violence. The reality was a far cry from the songs of the minstrels, a far more effective cure for romantic notions than any sermon. Survivors of the Crusades were irrevocably changed, becoming thinner, dirtier, and somehow both older and younger at once. They carried the weight of what they had seen and done, their bodies and souls etched with the scars of their ordeal. You too would develop a twitch whenever someone says the word pilgrimage, a subtle, involuntary physical reaction to the trauma you had endured. This illustrated the profound psychological scarring that permeated the ranks, a fundamental re-evaluation of previous ideals of honour and purpose. The experience didn't just transform your physical appearance, it altered the very fabric of your being, leaving an indelible mark that time would struggle to erase, a quiet internal monument to your suffering. Upon returning home, crusaders were often labelled heroes, expected to recount incredible tales of valour and divine intervention. This societal pressure forced you to gloss over the deeply chaotic, morally confusing and constantly damp reality you had actually experienced. You were compelled to invent narratives that pretended you knew what you were doing the whole time, to fit cultural expectations of honour and heroism. The truth, with its hunger disease and disorganisation, was simply too ugly, too uninspiring for the romantic ears of those who had stayed home. You became an actor performing the role of a hero while secretly carrying the quiet, grim truth of your harrowing journey. It was a silent burden, the weight of a fabricated glory. The harrowing experience of the Crusades fundamentally complicated and ultimately reshaped your faith. Where once there were clear lines, good and evil, saved and damned, your worldview now shifted to a more pragmatic, cynical trust in strong shoes and not eating anything that's still moving. The abstract certainties of dogma gave way to the tangible, immediate realities of survival. This demonstrated how the brutal realities of the campaign profoundly altered your moral and spiritual frameworks, emphasizing tangible realities over abstract ideals. You still believe perhaps, but your God now seemed to reside more in the resilience of your body and the sharpness of your wits than in the grand pronouncements of popes. Local peasantry actively resisted the Crusaders' presence and demands, often attacking supply lines and refusing to donate their entire winter food store. This active form of economic discontent and self-preservation directly challenged the invading army's authority and highlighted your vulnerability to localized resistance. These were not enemies in shining armor. They were desperate farmers defending their livelihoods, and their resistance, though fragmented, was incredibly effective. You, the Crusader, quickly learned that the holy mission meant little to a family facing starvation because of your passage. Their resistance was a powerful practical counterpoint to your spiritual aspirations, proving that a hungry peasant was a formidable foe. Villages along your route barricaded their gates and hid their livestock collectively, viewing the Crusaders as a moving catastrophe and a walking plague parade. This organized defensive response to the perceived threat showcased a widespread resistance to foreign encroachment and disruption. They weren't just protecting their possessions. They were protecting their way of life, their very existence, from a massive, unpredictable force. You saw the fear and determination in their eyes, recognizing that to them you were little different from any other invading horde despite your holy cross. Their collective action was a testament to the power of a united community defending its own, a silent and effective form of protest. Locals intentionally provided misleading directions, aiming to send the Crusaders away, or on fruitless detours rather than assisting their progress. This subtle sabotage was an effective form of resistance, contributing to the army's perpetual state of being lost, and further eroding your morale. You'd march for days trusting the vague hand gestures of a local, only to find yourself deep in a forest miles from where you intended to be. It was a silent war of attrition, where the local populace used their intimate knowledge of the land against the cumbersome, clueless invaders. You learned that navigating this world was far more complex than simply following a map, especially when the map itself was suspect or the locals actively wished you ill, sending you on a wild goose chase rather than towards Jerusalem. Attempts at communication frequently broke down into comical but frustrating misunderstandings. With severe language and cultural barriers, you might accidentally demand someone's wife when earnestly trying to ask for water, leading to immediate alarm and hostility. Or in a particularly absurd scenario, explaining your holy mission might inexplicably devolve into proposing to a goat, leaving both you and the bewildered local utterly confused and likely offended. These blunders exacerbated tensions and often led to swift, often violent breakdowns in negotiations. The locals already wary would react with understandable alarm or outright hostility. You realized that words stripped of context and proper translation could be far more dangerous than any sword, turning simple interactions into volatile, unpredictable encounters. Beyond passive resistance and misdirection, the Crusaders often faced overt hostility. You might be met with children throwing turnips with surprising accuracy, their small, angry faces a testament to the deep-seated resentment of the local populace. They saw you not as holy warriors, but as broke, heavily armed tourists with boundary issues, a disruptive force that brought only trouble and demands. This overt aggression, even from the young, underscored the complete breakdown of any perceived legitimacy your mission might have once held for these communities. You were simply an unwanted presence, and they were not afraid to make that known even with root vegetables as their chosen projectiles. The crusading force was famously the strangest collection of people ever assembled outside of a tavern brawl. Imagine a toothless baker attempting to wield a rolling pin as a weapon, or a monk who swore constantly, his piety eroded by the relentless hardships. This highlighted the disparate, often unprepared and entirely amateur composition of an army that utterly lacked formal military coherence. You were part of this motley crew, surrounded by individuals who had little in common beyond a shared journey and a vague understanding of their purpose. It was less an army and more a wandering, desperate congregation, proving that faith alone, while powerful, could not forge a disciplined military force. The presence of fanatics who genuinely believed themselves invincible due to divine favour led to suicidal charges into battle. These individuals, often shirtless, shoeless, and sometimes swordless, armed only with blind faith and a large stick, would hurl themselves at the enemy with reckless abandon. Their high mortality rate underscored the profound misjudgment and zealous extremism within the ranks. You'd watch them go a mixture of awe and horror, knowing that their misguided courage was often a death sentence. Their desperate, unthinking bravery was a stark contrast to your own growing pragmatism, a grim reminder of how faith could be both a powerful motivator and a dangerous delusion when divorced from practical reality. The campaign attracted opportunistic figures such as a merchant who roamed the camps, selling relics of dubious origin, often just twigs he'd picked up passed off as fragments of saints' bones. He capitalized on the religious fervor and desperation, peddling false hope for meager coin. These exploiters further muddied the campaign's stated spiritual purpose, with commercial cynicism proving that even a holy war could not escape the opportunism of the marketplace. You might scoff at his wares, but a part of you deep down might have been tempted to buy a twig just in case. After all, what was one more desperate gamble in a life full of them, especially when miracles seemed so scarce? The Crusader camps were rife with profound internal disorder and mini-anarchies, from brawls over who stole whose crust of bread, to the emergence of self-declared religious leaders like the Bishop of the Tents, who would hold impromptu sermons and offer questionable blessings. Chaos reigned. This constant infighting and power struggles revealed a severe lack of internal discipline and control, further eroding unit cohesion. It was a testament to how quickly social order could break down when formal authority was absent or ineffective, leaving you to navigate a complex web of petty rivalries and improvise leadership. You learned to keep your head down and your possessions close, for even your fellow pilgrims could become your adversaries. The only true unifying factor within this motley crew was mutual suffering and a vague, increasingly confused goal. This suggests that external command had largely failed, and cohesion such as it was maintained by shared misery and a collective, desperate hope of simply getting somewhere holy without dying. You were not united by strategy or discipline, but by the raw, visceral experience of enduring hardship together. It was a grim form of camaraderie, a bond forged in the crucible of shared pain where a knowing glance or a shared sigh spoke volumes about the unspoken understanding between you and your fellow equally miserable crusaders. The presence of individuals who fashioned a spear out of a soup ladle symbolized the systemic failure to adequately equip, train, and organize the army. This created a force of effectively discarded warriors, ill-prepared for real combat and struggling to even comprehend their basic mission. Their survival, if it came, was a matter of sheer luck rather than skill or foresight. You were part of this systemic problem, a testament to the grand delusion that faith alone could overcome fundamental deficiencies in planning and resources. It was a stark visual reminder of how utterly unprepared you all were for the brutal realities of the journey, leaving you to improvise, adapt, and desperately hope for the best, with tools designed for a very different kind of fight. As the sun sets on the Crusaders' journey, we are left not with tales of glorious conquest, but with the quiet, lingering echoes of profound personal change, deeply shaped by the crucible of medieval life, and the relentless grind of a war far more boring and brutal than any legend. You've experienced the physical discomforts, the systemic failures, and the raw, unvarnished truth of what it meant to be a common crusader. But beyond these tangible realities, there was an inner world, a social fabric woven from culture, etiquette, and relationships, however crude or strained. This segment will delve into these non-material and interpersonal aspects that profoundly shaped individual and collective life, revealing the inner landscape of the Crusader, often as barren and challenging as the physical one, yet surprisingly resilient in its own ways. Your journey began with the potent cultural force of loud, passionate, vaguely threatening sermons delivered by men in robes. These sermons, emphasizing sin salvation and the divine imperative of the Crusades, played a crucial role in mass persuasion, defining the acceptable narrative and suppressing dissent. You were told what to believe, what to fear, and what to hope for. This religious rhetoric was the language of your society, a powerful tool of social control that mobilized thousands, overriding personal doubts with the promise of eternal reward. It was a one-way street of communication, a torrent of divine instruction, designed to propel you forward regardless of your personal misgivings straight into the maw of uncertainty. Joining the crusade often stemmed from impulsive alcohol-fueled tavern conversations that rapidly escalated into holy oaths. These commitments, often made under the influence of strong drink and a misplaced sense of invincibility, were driven by powerful social pressure and the collective fervour of the moment. This highlighted a cultural tendency for collective, uncritical decision-making over individual rational thought. You might have woken up the next morning with a throbbing headache and a vague memory of pledging your life to a holy war, wondering what on earth you had done. It was a decision often born of fleeting bravado rather than sober reflection, but once made it became a binding oath difficult to escape, etched into your very soul, or at least your hangover. On the march, any semblance of orderly communication dissolved into a constant noise, a cacophony of everyone's talking, arguing, praying, singing, or coughing. This incessant din reflected a breakdown of established social norms, where clear hierarchical communication was replaced by a chaotic and often irritating background hum. You couldn't hear yourself think, let alone receive clear instructions. Orders were misunderstood, rumours spread like wildfire, and the sheer volume of human sound became another layer of your constant discomfort. It was a testament to the disorganisation, a sonic manifestation of the collective chaos, where meaningful dialogue was drowned out by the sheer pressure of thousands of voices all clamouring for something. Profound cross-cultural communication failures were a constant source of profound, often comical misunderstandings with local populations. The language barrier was immense, a chasm of mutual incomprehension. Attempts to ask for something as simple as water could accidentally become demanding someone's wife, leading to immediate alarm and hostility. Or in a particularly absurd scenario, explaining your holy mission might inexplicably devolve into proposing to a goat, leaving both you and the bewildered local utterly confused and likely offended. These blunders exacerbated tensions and led to rapid breakdowns in social interaction, turning simple exchanges into volatile, unpredictable encounters, further isolating you from the people whose lands you traversed. Even among supposed allies, shouting matches over whose saint was better, or liturgical disagreements about Lent, underscored deep-seated cultural and religious divisions. These constant internal bickering and theological squabbles prevented harmonious social interaction and diverted precious energy from the common goal. You were united by a cross on your tunic, but divided by centuries of regional customs and subtly different interpretations of faith. It was a reminder that even within the one true faith, humanity's endless capacity for division found a way to manifest itself, making true unity a fleeting, almost impossible dream. You learn to navigate these subtle currents of dissent, always keeping one ear open for the next theological debate that might break out into a physical altercation. The cultural environment implied a social tightrope walk where blunt opinions and direct critiques were rare, at least openly. You often found yourself muttering spiritual threats under your breath at allies who annoyed you while maintaining a facade of civility and cooperation. This illustrated the pervasive fear of open confrontation and the cultural value placed on outward decorum, even when insincere. It was a world of unspoken resentments and simmering frustrations where true feelings were often hidden behind a veil of strained politeness or passive aggression. You learn to read between the lines to understand the true meaning behind a carefully worded insult, or a pointed silence for peace was a fragile commodity. The act of wearing a patch sewn onto your tunic with a prominent red cross blessed by a priest served as a powerful public performance of your commitment and spiritual identity. This visible declaration of purpose was a cultural signal expected of all crusaders affirming their shared mission. It wasn't just a piece of fabric, it was a uniform, a badge of honour, or as you later realised, perhaps a rather conspicuous target signalling your belonging to this massive collective undertaking. This performative piety was a public affirmation, a way to show the world and perhaps yourself that you were truly devoted to the cause, even as your resolve wavered under the weight of daily reality. Crusaders frequently invoked God's name, declaring they were leaving in the name of God, or referring to makeshift weapons as God's toothpick. This performative use of religious language was a powerful cultural mechanism to bolster morale, justify actions, and reinforce the spiritual legitimacy of their often brutal campaign. It was a way to imbue mundane, often horrifying actions with divine purpose, providing a comforting, if sometimes tenuous sense of righteousness. You heard it constantly, the invocation of the divine, a chorus that often sounded more like a desperate plea than a confident declaration of faith, a constant whisper of the sacred amidst the profane. The nobleman's inspirational cries of "forward men," before promptly disappearing, represented a performative aspect of aristocratic leadership. This brief, grand gesture maintained the social expectation of command and valour, despite its profound detachment from the actual engagement and daily hardships endured by the rank and file. He was performing his role as a leader, adhering to the societal script even if his actions offered no real guidance or support. You learned to view these pronouncements with a cynical eye, understanding that they were more about maintaining appearances than about genuinely inspiring or leading from the front, a subtle piece of theatre played out on a very real, very muddy stage. Amidst the chaos and despair, collective singing of hymns and prayers served as a vital cultural performance. These shared rituals provided moments of communal solace, a fleeting sense of peace in the midst of turmoil. They reaffirmed spiritual bonds, acting as a powerful, if temporary, psychological anchor against the overwhelming sense of loss and confusion. You would join in your voice, blending with hundreds of others, finding a strange comfort in the shared sound, a brief respite from the harsh realities. It was a communal act of faith, a way to reassert a collective purpose, when all other forms of order had broken down, a shared melody in a world of dissonance. In the face of terrifying and disorganized combat, individuals often engaged in performative bravery, charging forward not out of strategy, but because everyone else is doing it, driven by intense social pressure. This collective, often reckless action became a cultural expectation within the chaotic battle environment. You didn't want to be the one who hesitated, the one who broke ranks. So you pushed forward your own fear, subsumed by the momentum of the crowd, participating in a dance of death where individual agency was often lost to collective unthinking action. It was a tragic form of peer pressure where the cost of nonconformity could be your life or your perceived honour, an ignoble end to a supposedly noble cause. The overwhelming motivation for joining the Crusades was intense religious fervour, driven by charismatic sermons and the Pope's promise of divine absolution for sins. This belief system framed the entire endeavour as a sacred spiritual quest, imbuing every hardship with profound religious significance. You truly believed you were fighting for God, that your suffering was a holy sacrifice. This fervent belief was the engine of the entire movement, a powerful emotional force that sustained you through incredible adversity, convincing you that your pain served a higher divine purpose even as your body screamed for simple relief. Despite overwhelming evidence of chaos, suffering, and incompetence, you and your fellow crusaders clung stubbornly to a divine purpose. You often interpreted hardships as a test from God or the work of the devil, filtering your brutal experiences through a deeply ingrained spiritual lens to find meaning in your plight. It was a coping mechanism, a way to rationalize the inexplicable horrors and discomforts of your journey. Your faith, however complicated, provided a framework, however tenuous, for understanding a world that was otherwise utterly senseless and cruel. Superstition was rampant, filling the gaps of rational understanding. A man might blame the devil for accidentally stabbing himself in the foot rather than his own clumsiness, or a monk might insist a particular rock was holier than others, demanding special reverence. These pervasive folk beliefs and omens provided a crude framework for understanding an otherwise inexplicable and terrifying world. You listened perhaps with a touch of skepticism, but also with a willingness to believe, for in a world so unpredictable, any explanation, however outlandish, offered a measure of comfort and a fleeting sense of control. The extreme hardships of the campaign profoundly complicated and ultimately reshaped your individual faith. It shifted from a belief in clear lines, good and evil, saved and damned, to a more pragmatic, cynical trust in strong shoes and not eating anything that's still moving. This demonstrated how the brutal realities of the crusade fundamentally altered your spiritual frameworks, leading you to emphasize tangible realities over abstract ideals. You still believed, but your faith was now grounded in the dirt and the blood, a hard-won understanding of divine will tempered by the relentless demands of survival. This was not the simple faith you started with. It was a complex, battle-scarred conviction forged in the crucible of absolute necessity. The intense suffering and widespread desperation fostered the emergence of splinter sects, where conventional beliefs bent under pressure. You might witness a group forming around a supposed vision of the Virgin Mary appearing in a chicken coop, their fervent belief providing a new, albeit bizarre, spiritual anchor. This phenomenon demonstrated how spiritual belief could fragment and reform under extreme duress, leading to new, often strange interpretations of faith. For some, these new improvised deities and rituals offered a more immediate, relatable comfort than the distant grand pronouncements of the Church. When the official answers failed, people found their own. Amidst the constant chaos and the erosion of individual faith, collective prayer and the singing of hymns remained a vital cultural and spiritual anchor. These shared rituals provided moments of communal connection, reaffirming a collective identity, however fractured in the face of immense psychological strain. You would find your voice joining with others, a collective murmur rising above the din of discomfort, a brief fragile moment of shared humanity, and a reminder of the spiritual thread that still bound you together, however loosely. It was a powerful, almost meditative act, offering a temporary reprieve from the relentless grind. Embarking on the Crusades meant a profound and often permanent severing of immediate family ties, a sacrifice that weighed heavily on your soul. It was epitomized by the poignant question from family members asking if God will be feeding you along the way. This highlights the immense personal cost and the emotional weight of separation. You left behind parents, siblings, perhaps a spouse and children, understanding that your chances of return were slim. The thought of their faces, their voices, their questions haunted your quieter moments, a constant ache of longing and a stark reminder of what you had traded for this holy quest. Amidst the pervasive squalor and deprivation of campaign life, you often yearned for the simple, cherished comforts of home. This was vividly exemplified by your profound longing for your mother's onion soup more than anything else the world could offer. It wasn't just about the food. It was about the warmth, the familiarity, the love embedded in that simple, humble dish. This yearning underscored the deep emotional connection to family and domesticity, a stark contrast to the cold, impersonal realities of the march. Even in the pursuit of divine glory, the human heart clung to the most basic comforting echoes of home. The comedic mishaps of accidentally demanding someone's wife, or proposing to a goat due to severe language and cultural barriers, underscored your utterly constrained agency in interactions with local communities. These encounters, far removed from any romantic or marital aspirations, revealed a profound inability to navigate unfamiliar social landscapes. You were a stranger in strange lands, unable to communicate your intentions, often perceived as a threat. These moments of profound miscommunication, while sometimes absurdly humorous in hindsight, were often terrifying in the moment, quickly turning peaceful encounters into volatile situations, further solidifying the chasm between you and the local populations. The intense, all-consuming focus on survival meant that personal relationships within the crusading army were largely pragmatic and transactional, forged out of necessity rather than deep affection. Mutual suffering became the sole unifying factor, reducing human connection to a shared endurance rather than genuine intimacy. You didn't seek deep emotional bonds. You sought a reliable tent mate, someone who wouldn't steal your crust of bread, someone to watch your back. Friendships were often born of convenience and shared misery, a pragmatic alliance against the relentless hardships rather than a blossoming of true affection. Love and marriage were distant concerns, luxuries of a life you had left far behind. Upon signing up for the crusade, your individual identity was immediately subsumed by the overarching collective. You became officially a crusader, identified by a patch sewn onto your tunic. This act signified a new primary group affiliation, often overriding prior clan or familial ties in public discourse. Your personal lineage, your family's history, your individual aspirations all took a back seat to this new, all-encompassing identity. You were no longer simply you. You were a part of the greater whole, a tiny interchangeable piece in a massive if disorganized movement, unified by a symbol of faith and a shared vague destination. The strangest collection of people ever assembled found their primary collective identity forged not in shared heritage but in mutual suffering. This intense shared adversity transcended previous social distinctions, making you not in good company, but weird company that would get lost together. This commonality of misery became the most potent bond uniting peasants and minor nobles alike in a shared understanding of hardship. It was a peculiar form of camaraderie where the very act of enduring the same appalling conditions created a strange, unbreakable connection between disparate souls. You were a collective entity of suffering marching towards an uncertain fate. While explicit clan honour was not directly detailed on the march, the societal expectation back home to be labelled a hero and to recount incredible tales profoundly influenced survivors. This pressure to polish stolen relics and pretend you knew what you were doing the whole time speaks to the pervasive concern for maintaining reputation within their communities, however disingenuous. You would return not as the broken, disillusioned person you had become, but as the valiant warrior society expected. Your clan's honour and your own depended on crafting a narrative of glorious purpose and brave deeds, obscuring the uncomfortable truths of survival. Survivors returned home profoundly transformed, physically and psychologically. Having aged 15 years in your soul, they carried a new identity shaped by the brutal crusade, an experience that permanently shifted their sense of self and their place within societal structures, often with lasting quiet trauma. You were no longer the person who left. The march had scoured away your innocence, replaced it with a weary wisdom, and left you with ghosts that only you could see. The world at home might have looked the same, but you irrevocably changed, would never quite fit back into the life you had known. The pilgrimage to a holy land had instead been a pilgrimage through your own soul, leaving it forever scarred. As the sun sets on the Crusaders' journey, we are left not with tales of glorious conquest, but with the quiet, lingering echoes of profound personal change, deeply shaped by the crucible of medieval life and the relentless grind of a war far more boring and brutal than any legend. You've now glimpsed the full spectrum, the grand distant papal mandates, the profound human cost, the systemic failures and the personal transformations. It's a story not of heroes in shining armour, but of resilient, often desperate individuals grappling with forces far beyond their control, clinging to fragments of faith and the bare necessity of survival. The past, in its unvarnished reality, offers lessons not always in triumph, but in endurance and the quiet, persistent struggle of the human spirit. As the long shadows of history begin to stretch and fade, slowly drawing us back from the dust-choked roads and mud-soaked camps of the Crusades, you can feel the quiet return. The clanking of armour, the groaning of weary feet, the distant mournful hymns, they soften into echoes gently dissolving into the stillness of your present moment. You've walked with the common crusader, felt the discomfort of their damp clothes, tasted the grim stew, and understood the profound disillusionment that replaced their initial fervent hopes. Now let the lingering chill of a medieval desert night, or the pervasive dampness of a European spring campaign slowly give way to the warmth of your own room, the soft comfort of your bed. The anxieties of that ancient world, its ceaseless struggles for food and safety, its lack of simple hygiene, its constant threat of disease, these were their daily realities. For you now there is only the gentle hum of modern life, the soft glow of a lamp, and the quiet comfort of knowing you are safe, well fed, and perhaps delightfully clean. Allow your mind to drift from the chaotic battlefields and the endless marches, from the faces of strangers and the smell of regret. Instead, focus on the steady rhythm of your own breath, the quiet contentment of your surroundings. The journey of the Crusader was one of stark, unvarnished truth, a testament to human endurance, and a powerful reminder of how much has changed, and how some struggles in different forms still endure. Let those historical whispers cradle you now, transforming from vivid scenes into a soft, comforting haze. There's no more need to march, no more need to fight, no more need to yearn for a clean pair of socks, just gentle stillness. As the last echoes of this past age recede, allow peace to settle over you, inviting a deep and restorative sleep. Rest now knowing that the struggles of yesterday are far behind you, leaving only the quiet of the night.